You sit here before me, and though I cannot see your face, I can sense the weight in your shoulders, the breath you hold, as though the silence itself might break you open. Something inside has pressed against glass for years, and now the glass has begun to crack. This is what I call the threshold, the day the empath snaps. It is not mere temper, not rebellion for show, but the irreversible moment when the soul refuses to serve as sponge for the world's grief. Archetypes within you shift, as though the constellations of your inner sky realigned while you slept. The ordinary self feels a tremor, but the deeper self stirs awake. For decades, you may have lived at the gates of other people's pain, believing it was your sacred assignment to absorb it. You mistook this survival reflex for a divine calling. A child once learned to read the moods of a household like weather, to shrink when storms brewed, to glow when the room demanded light. That child's persona hardened into a mask of grace, hiding a trembling core. Behind the mask was not sainthood but strategy, an intelligent way to avoid chaos by becoming useful, sensitive, endlessly open. And so the adult grows into the role of the unguarded caretaker, smiling even when exhausted, forgiving before wounds are named. But the psyche has its secret laws. Every yes whispered when your heart meant no, every forgiveness granted too soon, every burden you carried that was not yours. These became entries in the shadow's ledger. The unconscious does not forget. Each compromise was stored in a vault deep inside, and though the vault is vast, it is not infinite. The day of snapping comes when that vault bursts, when all the denied rage and grief flood upward like water breaking a dam. It is not a polite correction. It is an archetypal eruption. You might wake one morning and find that the smallest trespass now feels unbearable. A friend who once leaned on you at 2 a.m. meets silence. A family member who hurled their fury at you for years finds a wall instead of a soft field. To outsiders, it may look like cruelty, even betrayal. But this is the psyche restoring balance. The empath who once bent toward others now bends toward themselves. And in this shift lies the first breath of individuation, the slow discovery of which inner God truly claims your soul. The false idol of overgiving demands endless sacrifice and offers only exhaustion. To turn away is not abandonment. It is devotion to truth. Myths mirror this truth. The warrior lays down his sword and refuses to fight another's war. The healer vanishes into wilderness to tend her own wounds. The prophet turns away from the crowd and listens only for the voice in the wind. They are not betraying their callings, but refining them. And so it is for you. To stop absorbing is to start listening, to shelter within your own soul rather than drowning in another's storm. In the dream language of the unconscious, this turning may appear as a locked door opening into a room you have never entered. Inside waits your double, calm and unblinking, indifferent to the masks you've worn. This figure knows only your essence, stripped of the compulsion to be needed. Meeting this gaze is destabilizing. Something in you shifts so profoundly you cannot return to old ways. Even if you try, the compulsion is broken. Yet this eruption carries danger. Power reclaimed suddenly can scorch if not guided. Blind rage risks severing ties with those who genuinely love you. Retreat into total isolation can trick you into mistaking exile for freedom. The archetype of the hermit has wisdom, but too soon it becomes prison. Consciousness must mediate. You cannot simply unleash shadow, you must integrate it, and here the collective dimension emerges. When you stop absorbing, those around you must face their own sorrow without the buffer of your body. Some resist, some rage, some crumble. Your silence becomes their mirror, and not all will wish to look. Yet this is the necessary cruelty of truth. Each soul must carry its own burden. No one can outsource their suffering forever. As the weeks and months unfold after this snapping, dreams may blaze more vividly, as if your psyche celebrates its reclaimed sovereignty. You may dream of walking into your childhood home, finding it stripped but glowing with light, or of standing at the edge of vast waters, at last free to swim. Such dreams are not mere symbols. They are confirmations from the unconscious that a new path has begun. Still, old patterns linger like ghosts. The urge to rescue is tenacious. It whispers that you are needed, that only you can save them. In those moments, remember, the truest help is not to carry another's pain, but to stand as a living example of one who has carried their own. Only then does empathy flow without hidden bargains of self-sacrifice. Only then does compassion rise from abundance rather than depletion. Even your persona begins to crack. The carefully practiced smile, the nod of agreement while your soul recoils. Behind the fractured mask, archetypes stir like gods returning from exile. The warrior rises first, not with reckless violence but with quiet authority, a sentinel claiming the right to guard boundaries. Its concern is not whether you are liked, but whether you are whole. Alongside it steps the shadow, the terrible twin, heavy with everything you suppressed. Anger at being used, grief at being unseen, resentment of kindness assumed infinite. The darkness feels immense because you behold it without denial for the first time. But it is not enemy. It is guardian. It demands to be known, not destroyed. If resisted, the shadow will not vanish. It will leak as illness, bitterness, restless dreams. The psyche will always move toward balance, even if by painful means. Thus, the empath who snaps but refuses integration risks becoming what they fled. A figure who drains others in subtler ways, demanding the validation once given away. Here, the stakes sharpen. Snapping alone is not transformation. Integration must follow. So, as you stand in this threshold, the vault open, the warrior awake, the shadow revealed, recognize that the eruption is not the end, but the beginning. The snapping is thunder, yes, but thunder clears the sky for what comes next. This is the threshold moment of your story. The day the empath snaps, the rupture that will soon demand integration. From here we move deeper into how individuation calls you forward, how myths echo your struggle, and how the shadow's encounter begins to shape the path towards sovereignty. You stand at the edge of rupture, the vault of shadow opened, and the echo of thunder still reverberating in your bones. Now comes the turning, not back toward the old self, but inward toward the center. This is not collapse. It is individuation. The reorientation of life away from false idols of overgiving toward the sovereignty of the self. At first, the change feels ruthless. You find yourself saying no with a finality that shocks you. Where once your lips parted to soothe, now silence hangs. Friends accustomed to midnight rescues feel abandoned. Family who relied on your endless tolerance find a boundary they cannot cross. And yet, beneath the discomfort, something fierce stirs, an authority that belongs not to ego, but to the self reclaiming its rightful domain. This is not selfishness. It is psychic law. Balance cannot be postponed forever. Carl Jung spoke of individuation as the process by which the psyche becomes whole, integrating conscious and unconscious elements. But the empath's path is uniquely perilous. For years, your ego identified with service, absorbing others' wounds as if salvation depended on it. The self tolerated this imbalance only so long. When the snap arrives, it tears away that mask and forces you to ask, which inner God am I truly serving? The idol of exhaustion, or the living source of my own being? Myths across cultures carry this question. Consider the warrior who lays down his weapon, refusing to fight battles that are not his own. The act seems cowardly to onlookers, but in truth it is courage. The refusal to sacrifice one's essence to false causes. Or the healer who retreats to wilderness, letting wounds fester in silence until she tends to her own. To the village, she appears faithless. In reality, she is incubating her next gift. Or the prophet who stops speaking, letting the crowd disperse, because the only voice worth hearing is the whisper of wind through branches. These figures embody the same archetypal truth. Withdrawal is not abandonment, but refinement. And yet, the first steps inward can be confusing. You may find yourself feeling colder, detached, even cruel. Old conditioning whispers that you are betraying your essence by protecting yourself. But what you are truly betraying is the illusion that love requires depletion. Individuation teaches a new rhythm, to give without erasure, to hold without drowning. This demands a radical shift. The self becomes the axis around which your life revolves, not the endless needs of others. Dreams may mirror this transition. You might dream of breaking ropes that bind your hands, of walls collapsing to reveal open skies. These images symbolize liberation, but also caution. Freedom without direction risks dissolving into chaos. In Jungian language, this is the archetype of the wanderer, compelled to roam, thrilled by release, but vulnerable to aimlessness. The task is not to wander endlessly, but to anchor in the self, to inhabit freedom with purpose. The shadow also presses forward more insistently now. For years it carried resentment, grief, and unexpressed fury. As it emerges, you may feel overwhelmed, as though darkness outweighs light. But this is only because you are seeing it unfiltered. The shadow is not destruction, it is reclamation. Each pang of anger is a fragment of power returning. Each tear of grief is a piece of your soul demanding acknowledgement. To turn away now would be to exile yourself again. Integration begins by letting the shadow speak. Write its truths, even if they unsettle you. Admit the anger at being used, the sadness of invisibility, the shame of endless compliance. Only when the ledger is read aloud can it be cleared. Jung taught that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That is your task now. Not to purge the shadow, but to weave it into the fabric of your wholeness. This weaving is painful. Relationships strain under the pressure. Those who benefited from your unguarded compassion may accuse you of betrayal. They demand you return to the role you once played. And here lies the razor's edge. Will you collapse back into overgiving, or will you hold steady in your new authority? Each test is archetypal, not personal. Each conflict is a chance to prove your allegiance to the self. At times, you may feel tempted to overcorrect, to sever ties too quickly, to build walls so high that nothing can reach you. This phase is understandable, a psychic swing toward protection after years of exposure. But individuation does not end with armor. True wholeness requires permeability, to let life touch you without consuming you. The self seeks balance, not withdrawal. To imagine this balance, picture the image of two wings of a bird. empathy, and protection. Neither is sufficient alone. Together they allow flight. Before, you flapped one wing furiously, empathy without boundary, and so you could only circle, exhausting yourself. Now, individuation calls you to strengthen the other wing, protection, so that both can move in harmony. Only then do you soar. The myths remind us, transformation is not linear. Persephone must descend before she can rise. Inanna is stripped before she meets her shadow sister. Christ enters wilderness before his ministry. Likewise, you must pass through the crucible of detachment, anger, and grief before compassion can be reborn. This is the individuation spiral: descent, confrontation, and eventual integration. As the path unfolds, notice the subtle alchemy at work. Your compassion, once tinged with fear of abandonment, disapproval, invisibility, becomes clearer. Your love, once scented with desperation, now carries the fragrance of choice. You give not because you must, but because you may. This is individuation's gift, the restoration of freedom. So here you stand, no longer the martyr, not yet the sovereign, but in the fiery middle passage where the false gods of overgiving lose their power. It is raw, disorienting, sometimes lonely, yet it is necessary. The warrior within has awakened. The shadow insists on being seen, and the myths whisper that you are not alone in this descent. The turning towards self is both terrifying and liberating. It is the refusal to serve exhaustion any longer. It is the beginning of walking toward a center that has always been yours. From this point, the story widens. For the snapping is not only personal, it reverberates through your relationships, your dreams, and the collective itself. Next, we turn to the fallout. The pushback of others, the guidance of symbols in dreams, and the cost of transformation on the bonds that once defined you. The thunder has sounded, the turning towards self has begun, and now the world begins to shift around you. For years you absorbed the grief of others, shielding them from their own storms. But when you stop, the silence reverberates outward like a bell. Those who once leaned on you suddenly face their own burdens, and their responses vary. Resistance, anger, collapse. This is the collective impact of your snapping. It is not only your psyche that feels the rupture. Families, friendships, communities, all adjust when an empath steps out of role. Some people rage because you no longer carry their pain. Others crumble when forced to hold their own sorrow. Still others try to bargain, reminding you of past rescues, pleading for the person you used to be. Their reactions are mirrors, projections of their refusal to own what has always been theirs. Jung might call this the necessary cruelty of individuation, the truth that each soul must carry its own cross. And yet, your task is not to rescue them from this confrontation. To do so would be to betray your own emergence. Instead, you stand steady, not detached, but discerning. You let them feel the sharp edges of their own grief. You allow their resistance to unfold without rushing to soften it. This is not indifference, it is respect. By stepping back, you return responsibility to its rightful owner. In the nights following such confrontations, dreams become vivid, as if the unconscious itself celebrates the restored balance. You may dream of returning to your childhood home, empty, yet radiant with light. The message is clear. The old self has departed, but the house of your soul stands ready to be inhabited by the true occupant. Another dream might bring you to the edge of a vast sea, the horizon wide and shimmering, inviting you to swim. This is the promise of freedom. Not freedom from feeling, but freedom from bondage to others' emotions. Other symbols arrive with primal force. Wild animals, wolves, bears, panthers, appear at the edges of forests. These creatures are not threats, though they may feel dangerous. They are your instinctual powers, long exiled because they frightened the polite world. Now they return, demanding recognition. Each growl and stare says, strength is not an enemy of compassion. Instinct is not opposed to empathy. They are the raw energies you must learn to integrate, lest they turn destructive. Another dream image, cutting ropes from your hands, smashing through walls. These are liberations, but they also warn you. Freedom without anchoring can dissolve into chaos. The archetype of the wanderer lurks here, thrilling in release but vulnerable to aimlessness. You must resist the temptation to confuse rupture with destination. Snapping is thunder, but the greening earth comes after the storm only if you learn to tend it. Relationships bear the heaviest weight of this passage. Some collapse with startling speed. Bonds you thought eternal reveal themselves to have been held together only by your self-erasure. Others deepen now that you meet as equals rather than caretaker and dependent. Still others rupture and reform on new terms, cracked open and rebuilt with honesty. Each shift is painful, but also liberating. The false contracts of overgiving are burned away, leaving only those connections that can survive in truth. There is grief in this too. You mourn not only the people who fall away, but the self who made them possible. The compliant version of you, always available, endlessly forgiving, was flawed, but it kept you alive. To let that persona dissolve is to bury an old protector. Tears come not only for others, but for the loss of who you once were. This grief is sacred. It acknowledges that even survival strategies deserve thanks before being laid to rest. And then comes temptation. The pull to return to old roles surfaces in moments of weakness. An old friend calls in crisis. A new acquaintance carries suffering that feels achingly familiar. The urge to rescue flares. But here lies the test. Will you step back into the old cycle, or will you hold steady at the center of your circle? Each choice strengthens one path and weakens the other. Individuation is not sealed by thunder alone, but by repeated acts of fidelity to the self. To anchor in this fidelity, recall the truth of clean empathy. To stand as witness, not as sponge. True compassion is not martyrdom. It is presence that holds space without being consumed. This shift is subtle yet radical. You still feel the undercurrents in a room. You still sense when someone hides pain. But you no longer carry it in your body. You no longer sacrifice your vitality to soothe what is not yours. At times, this stance feels cold. But coldness is the judgment of those still addicted to your overgiving. In reality, it is clarity. You can finally love without bargaining away your life force. This is empathy transformed, not depletion, but abundance. The paradox is that once you stop being drained, you find yourself able to give more freely than ever. Because now your giving is not prison, but choice. The collective, however, does not adjust easily. Some will test your new boundaries, probing to see if this transformation is real. They may accuse you of hardness, betrayal, even cruelty. They may weaponize guilt. You've changed. You used to be so kind. But kindness chained to fear is not true kindness, and you now embody something freer, love unbound by compulsion. Those who can meet you here find a new quality of connection, lighter, more mutual, free of hidden debts. Over time, the urgency of snapping fades, replaced by steady knowing. You no longer define yourself by wounds or sacrifices, though you carry their wisdom. You are not desperate to be everything for everyone. You begin to sense that your deepest gift is not your willingness to suffer, but your courage to stand whole. Thus, the collective fallout and the dream symbols, painful though they are, become part of the same movement. The slow alchemy of shifting from compulsion to sovereignty. The empath who snaps is not lost. They are reborn, tested by the pushback of others, guided by dreams, sobered by grief, and steadied by the self. And so, the path curves deeper inward. Having faced the storm's fallout, you arrive at the temple within, where Anima and Animus wait, where threshold guardians rise, and where discernment becomes the gatekeeper of wholeness. You have walked through the storm of snapping, borne the backlash of others, and listened to the voices of dreams that rose like heralds from the unconscious. Now you come to the inner sanctum, the temple of your soul. Here the work deepens, not just to refuse the false idol of overgiving, but to awaken new figures of authority within you. Anima and Animus, the archetypal companions of your psychic wholeness. In the dream corridors of this temple, mirrors line the walls. They do not show the face you wear in daily life, but fragments of selves from other times and hidden moments. Some reflections comfort you, others unsettle. The message is unmistakable. You are not one static identity, but a constellation, a parliament of archetypes waiting for their turn in the light. Among these, one figure steps forward with special significance: the Anima or the Animus, depending on your conscious alignment. If you lean more toward the masculine, Anima appears, not as romantic muse, but as the embodiment of your neglected feeling life. She might come in dreams as a woman of impossible beauty, standing at the edge of a forest, silent yet beckoning you into the unknown. She carries no words, only presence, and her gaze tells you the path ahead is not safe but necessary. If you lean more toward the feminine, Animus emerges, not as the inner tyrant that once drove you into endless service, but as a steady voice of clarity. He might appear in dream as a quiet guardian handing you a key, pointing toward a door you had not noticed. Both bring the same message. There is more to you than the role you played. To meet Anima or Animus is to confront neglected dimensions of yourself. The Anima leads you to feeling depths you once suppressed in caretaking others. The Animus hands you authority that is not borrowed from compliance but forged from within. These meetings are not luxuries. They are thresholds. They force you to expand your sense of self beyond survival strategy, beyond persona. They remind you that love without boundaries is not love, and authority without compassion is not authority. But the temple is guarded. On its threshold stands the archetype of discernment, appearing as sphinx, dragon, or angel with flaming sword. These guardians are not enemies. They are examiners, ensuring you have learned to decide who and what may enter the sanctuary of your inner life. Without discernment, the temple decays into marketplace, sacredness trampled underfoot. This is why boundaries are holy. They keep the temple intact. Discernment does not mean judgment in the moral sense. It is not condemnation, but clarity. It is the ability to say, "This belongs inside, this remains outside." In practical terms, it may mean refusing the call that demands your midnight rescue, even if guilt claws at you. It may mean letting a friend rage without absorbing the fire into your own body. It may mean walking away from those who insist that your compassion is endless currency. Each act of discernment is an act of sovereignty, a recognition that the temple must be protected or it will collapse. In this space, the alchemy of wholeness begins. For years, your empathy and your protection were split apart, one wing flapping furiously while the other remained limp. Now, in the temple, you see the two as halves of the same power. Jung might say, empathy and self-protection are two wings of one bird. Together, they allow flight. Alone, they lead only to exhaustion or isolation. This balance is not easily maintained. At first, you may swing wildly, cutting off too much, refusing all intimacy, mistaking distance for freedom. But individuation tolerates this corrective phase only briefly. Eventually, the self demands integration. Wholeness is not invulnerability. It is the capacity to be permeable without drowning, strong without hardening, compassionate without depletion. Here, rituals become essential. Not rituals imposed by tradition, but those born of your own psyche's language. Daily dream writing, time in solitude, walking without agenda, these are ways of keeping the temple clean. They are not luxuries, they are maintenance of the foundation. For without tending, the temple decays, and you find yourself again vulnerable to intrusion. Within this temple, the throne of the self waits. It is not a throne of worldly dominance, but of inner order. When you take your seat, archetypes gather in council. Warrior, healer, shadow, anima, animus. They do not fight for dominance. They stand in circle, each voice honored, because you, the sovereign of this realm, have learned to listen without losing your center. This is the harmony that comes when discernment is practiced, when empathy and protection serve together. The world outside will not always understand this transformation. Some will accuse you of hardness, betrayal, ingratitude. They will invoke the old contracts, the rescues you once provided, the ways you were always there. They will test your new guardianship, probing to see if the temple is truly defended. But you will find you no longer need to defend yourself loudly. Your silence itself has weight, rooted in the stone of your own throne. And paradoxically, this new stance makes you softer where it matters most. Before, your kindness was tangled with fear of being invisible if you were not indispensable. Now your kindness is free, no longer bartered for belonging. Before, your love carried the scent of desperation. Now it carries the fragrance of choice. And those who can meet you in this clarity find love that is not heavy with obligation, but light with joy. This stage of temple and guardianship, Anima and Animus, does not end the journey. It is preparation for the final integration. The temple gives you the ground, the throne gives you the authority, but what remains is to stabilize compassion as a mature force, sensitive yet sovereign, boundaried yet generous. This is the path toward integration, sovereignty, and the paradoxical softness that comes after strength. And so, having walked into the temple, met guardians and companions, and taken your seat among archetypes, you are ready to enter the final act. The snapping was thunder, the temple is foundation, but now the question arises, what does integration look like when lived daily? How does sovereignty express itself in compassion? And what happens if you refuse this path? That is where we now turn. You have entered the temple, taken your seat among the archetypes, and begun to recognize discernment as sacred guardianship. Now comes the culmination, the work of integration, sovereignty, and the rebirth of compassion, no longer tangled with fear. This is the slow greening after thunder, the day after the empath snaps, when the storm subsides and the world looks unfamiliar yet full of possibility. Integration is not stitching together fragments of old and new. It is not taping the mask back onto your face. It is the recreation of wholeness. a psychic order in which every archetype, warrior, healer, shadow, anima, animus, has a place at the council. They no longer pull you apart, demanding opposite allegiances. They stand in harmony because you have learned to listen without abandoning your center. This is not perfection. It is balance, the ability to hold contradictions without collapsing into either extreme. To live in integration is to know that empathy is no longer a compulsion, nor is self-protection a fortress. They become two wings of the same bird. Empathy feels the subtle vibrations of another's grief, but sovereignty decides whether that grief enters your heart. Protection establishes boundaries, but not from fear, only from clarity. The bird flies because both wings move together. In daily life, this balance looks deceptively ordinary. You answer a call not because you fear rejection if you don't, but because you choose to. You say no to a demand not out of cruelty, but because yes would violate your truth. You sit with someone's sorrow without absorbing it, letting their tears move through the air without soaking your skin. What seems simple is in fact revolutionary. Empathy without erasure, compassion without depletion. Still, the psyche tests what it has built. Old patterns return in disguise. A friend whose suffering echoes your past may appear, asking silently for the old rescuer. A new relationship may tempt you to dissolve into caretaking again. Each test asks, have you truly changed? Or do the false gods of overgiving still hold sway? Each time you choose presence without self-abandonment, the self strengthens its hold. This does not make you untouchable. There will still be moments when the pull of old habits flares like an old wound. But now you know how to pause. You know how to breathe, to stand in awareness, and to choose. Sometimes you will step forward. Sometimes you will step back. Either way, the choice is yours, and that makes all the difference. Here lies the paradox of maturity. Sensitivity deepens rather than diminishes. You feel more acutely than ever the currents in a room, the unshed tears in another's eyes, the anger vibrating under someone's words. But they no longer dictate your path. You sense another's grief without carrying it. You love fiercely without becoming consumed. You walk away without severing the thread of respect that binds one soul to another. This is empathy in its purest form, no longer martyrdom, but recognition of the sacred in each being. And so life reforms itself around you. People who once entangled you now step back, sensing that you are not someone to drain, but someone to meet as equal. Some approach with reverence, unable to name why. Others are unsettled, frustrated that their old hooks no longer pierce your skin. A few will test you, trying to pull you into familiar dances of need. They discover quickly that the temple is guarded, that the throne is occupied, and that sovereignty does not waver. The deeper mystery is that snapping has not made you harder. It has made you softer in the ways that matter. Before, your kindness was filtered through fear of abandonment, disapproval, invisibility. Now kindness is free, shining without shadow. Before, your love was thick with desperation. Now it carries the fragrance of choice. This is love as abundance, not obligation. You may wonder sometimes what would have happened if you had never snapped. Dreams may offer stark answers. Wells run dry, vessels crack, temples collapse into dust. The unconscious shows these images not to frighten you, but to remind you that the snapping was not failure, but survival. The self itself intervened to prevent your collapse. What you once thought was weakness revealed itself as a sacred breaking, a thunder meant to save your life. Thus, the snapping becomes less a rupture and more a foundation. You are no longer the sponge for the world's wounds, no longer the martyr for unspoken contracts, no longer the silent witness to your own erasure. You are the empath who has walked into shadow and returned with light intact. You are sovereign of your own soul. From your throne within, you give not because you must, but because you choose to, and because the well within you is fed by inexhaustible springs. This is integration, the paradox of being permeable yet sovereign, soft yet unyielding, compassionate yet discerning. It is not an ending, but a return, a homecoming to the self that has always waited beneath the masks. And so the snapping was thunder. What follows is greening, quiet, steady, fertile. The work is to live each day in this balance, to honor the temple within, to guard its gates with discernment, and to give from freedom. The thunder has passed, the council within assembled, and the sovereign self enthroned. What remains now is not drama but practice, the quiet rhythm of a life rebuilt on truth. Integration is never final. It is ongoing maintenance of wholeness. You will cycle through grief for years lost to overgiving, flashes of anger at those who exploited your openness, and relief at the freedom now tasted. But each cycle is gentler, less like rupture, more like tending a garden. Picture the image ladder of your journey, the temple you discovered, the throne of living rock where you sit, the council of archetypes in circle, the wings of empathy and protection lifting together, and the sovereignty that holds them all. These are not abstract symbols. They are maps of your psyche, touchstones you can return to whenever the old compulsion whispers. The paradox is now resolved. You are more sensitive than ever, yet not consumed. You feel currents acutely, but they do not drown you. You give, but not from exhaustion. You protect yourself, but not from fear. This is the strange maturity of an empath who has passed through the snapping. Sensitivity and sovereignty coexist, two wings of the same bird. Life outside reshapes itself to match your inner order. Some who once relied on you fade away. Others draw closer, attracted to the clarity you now embody. The world senses that you are not available for entanglement, but open for true connection. And those who can meet you here discover love that is lighter, clearer, and free of desperation. This is the final turning. Not thunder, but greening. Not rupture, but foundation. You exist not as martyr, but as sovereign. And from this position, your greatest gift is not endless giving, but the unwavering truth of who you are. So let the closing words be both blessing and invitation. I exist. I matter. I begin here. And in the next 24 hours, choose one boundary, small but firm, that honors your temple. In doing so, you will not only preserve your own life force, but also show the world that compassion shines brightest when it flows from freedom.